So a little background. The project's entitled Textiles as Spatial Enclosure in Architecture. So specifically looking at textiles as they form physical space more so than, though I will touch on it a little bit more so than like the surface of the textile. And it's an interesting project to me in that it is incredibly broad, looking across cultural, environmental, historical, contemporary contexts, while also being able to kind of dive into some very specific projects and specific issues that come with looking at textiles within this context. Textiles have a relative material fragility as compared to something like stone or wood, and so they also kind of hold a theoretical fragility and historical fragility in trying to research the subject. I wanted to start with this image because while it's not an explicitly architectural project, it's a stage curtain from My Fair Lady, a play. But it has, I think within this image, there's a sense of a moment in time that is very specific, that I think is a constant theme that comes through with employing textiles within an architectural space. So I wanted to start with this, which some of you have actually seen. This was sort of my entry point into my research. It is the Diwan-i-Khas at the Red Fort in Delhi, India. Just a quick kind of personal story, visited this site almost 10 years ago now. And I had a complete misreading of what the architectural space was. So on the right, you can see what it looks like today. Essentially, this pavilion is kind of isolated in within the ground, though there are other buildings around it. But in the past, up to about the mid-1800s, it would often have various awnings, or they're called shamania, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, deployed at various times in order to kind of create this divide between public and private access, and also to link the various pavilions as needed for various events. And I think what really interested me in this particular site was that I could go to the specific place and then completely misread how this space was being read because the textiles were no longer there. And then I didn't, at the time, have the pictorial imagery that I only revisited when I kind of discovered the paintings later. I was able to read this space entirely differently. So feeling like I was not getting kind of the full picture. But this project also kind of made me think about, so archaeological themes of kind of temporality, both the system of these awnings being deployed or put away, and then also the loss of the kind of reading of the space that many people who visit the site will never understand if they don't have a particular cultural understanding, right? And a lot of people don't when they're visiting. So in kind of thinking about that, I really wanted to go back and do a sort of archaeological, historical kind of reference point in my research. So I'm just going to touch on a few different things. And again, this kind of theme of like temporality and loss through various kinds of depictions. So in this case, the image on the right is an archaeological reconstruction of a site. And then on the left is this sort of fantastical depiction from a story that was written by, let's see the name of it. I'm blanking on his name, but the kind of fantastical depiction is in some ways more evocative of what the space might have been like, even if it's not as historically accurate. And what we're also seeing is that the textiles being integrated into this image on the left, they are doing this like job of creating space that you don't actually see in a reconstruction on the right. That's just the kind of the space of the like the stone and the stucco. So it kind of helped me understand that the way that we kind of view reconstructions, what we're seeing, we're not actually able to see all of kind of the context getting layered in. And it's even kind of a categorical issue of understanding textiles as contributors to architecture rather than decoration or clothing. So again, another way of looking at this kind of through an archaeological lens is through fragments. So one is the pictorial representations. Another is these fragments that you can still find. So on the left is a tent pole, and then on the right you can see in this kind of bottom corner here, these are rings that allow awnings to be tied onto them. So it was integrated within the architectural design, like within the stone. This wasn't something that was added later as an afterthought. This is very much something that is integrated, but at this site, the Bundi Fort, they no longer have them there. So it's something that is present only through the joint that still exists. Kind of the third way of looking at this archaeologically is through the physical fragments themselves. And there are many ways that historians can look at them, but there's like carbon dating for when these are actually produced, looking at the method of weaving, all of these kind of methodologies, the dyes, where those would have been produced, and how all these kind of systems of production came into play. But then there are several issues that come about. A lot of times these fragments are completely separated from their context, particularly when things get looted. If I go back to the example here, the British kind of overtook this site, and we don't actually know where these awnings are anymore. They may have been taken before the British arrived or during, but they're no longer connected, so we can't actually reproduce this in like exactitude. And then, on the other end, when you have these fragments, we don't know exactly. A lot of times, they're in museums. It was not documented as exactly where they were, how they were hung. We can look at things like there are tabs on this tent that we can look at to figure out how it was actually erected. This one, which is very rare, it's enough of it was left that was able to be semi-reconstructed. This object here on the left is particularly interesting because not only is it a fragment of a curtain, but it also is representative of the fact that, historically speaking, and actually in many contexts, but in this, I think this was Byzantine, this was actually a threshold of a kind, and that there was a servant that their job was to open up this curtain. So it's kind of both on the surface of the object and the object itself, right? That it could do that action, and it was representative of its own action. So kind of moving within that context, I wanted to think about some of the concepts through a historical lens on some level of like liminality and threshold. So I had to kind of identify what that really means. So a curtain, it's like the difference between the two are like a little bit hard to kind of parse out, but essentially a curtain can very easily be a threshold in that it is the object between two spaces, but it also has this kind of third. It's not necessarily a threshold on its own, but it creates, if it's kind of within context, there's a space on one end, space on the other end, and then the curtain itself creates this third space. And that third space, through a kind of situational context, placement, movement, that creates liminality. And in that way, the curtain kind of can hold a physical, sensory, or like temporal obstacle, and you can hold these things kind of within your mind all at once. And so that's kind of the liminal, third space that is created. I'm going to flip through. So this can come through in many different ways. So we have like the stage curtain. There's this moment of potentiality before the stage curtain is open. There's this implication that something will happen, and therefore that is kind of the liminal space that the curtain creates. And in many ways, the drawing of a curtain is actually more dramatic than an opening of the door, right? So it can hold a different weight than other kinds of architectural elements. I've kind of shown examples here of more like art rather than architecture, I think, because architecture struggles, or architectural representation often struggles to imply this sense of liminality that the curtain could possibly have. So in this image, the blurriness and the movement of the curtain helps us to understand this like very specific moment in time, and the liminality between two moments or two spaces. So I wanted to kind of jump forward a little bit in time to kind of consider Semper, Los, and modernism and the Bauhaus. So Semper is often referenced when discussing textiles and kind of his influence on modernism and the textile within a modernist context. So I'm just going to read a brief quote from Semper. So in his theory of dress, he talked about hanging carpets remained the true walls, the visible boundaries of space. The often solid walls behind them were necessary for reasons that had nothing to do with the creation of space. They were needed for security, for supporting a load, for their performance, for their permanence, and so on. Wherever the need for secondary functions did not arise, the carpets remained the original means of separating space. Even where building solid walls became necessary, the latter were only the inner invisible structures hidden behind the true and legitimate representatives of the wall, the colorful woven carpets. So essentially the cladding or the textile wall could become separated from structure. What the result of that was that there was a sort of acceptance that the underlying structure of the building was more important than the cladding. So in that sense, the building's envelope or the sort of wall that was not structure was sort of a corollary to the structure. And I think my belief on this is that the textile, in theory, was this cladding, but which would be important, but it got pushed into this concept of decoration. And because it was secondary to the concept of structure, and then as a result, it was almost, not entirely, eliminated from modernist discourse about architecture specifically. So it was never fully suppressing textiles. They still continued to find their way through in architecture in kind of more humble ways, like interior spaces, ornament, decoration, and craft, but its kind of agency within architecture was a bit underserved and tamped down. I've included here 2 examples of, on the left is a fragment of, by Audie Berger, who was in the textile, the weaving workshop at the Bauhaus, and then this is on the right is a drawing by Annie Albers, who's also from the Bauhaus. And at the Bauhaus, there were, the women were pretty much moved into the weaving workshop. Well, men could kind of choose within whichever school they wanted to focus in and study. So there was this kind of movement of women are going into this textile realm. And in addition to that, I think Annie Albers, partly because of her move out to New Haven and Yale, she was much better known, also through her husband, Joseph Albers, who's an artist. But Audie Berger was someone who was almost completely forgotten. She was Jewish, and she was unable to work in Germany and was eventually killed during World War II for being Jewish. And a lot of her work was almost completely forgotten. Just in the last 10 years has her work been rediscovered. And she did a lot of really excellent detailed work on the actual kind of structure of weaving, and she taught at the Bauhaus as well. So there's definitely this kind of theme of even prominent textile workers within an architectural context getting erased for various reasons, and we're still learning so much about them, and it's just starting to become kind of uncovered. Another figure who's kind of important within the modernist kind of realm was Lily Reich. She was known for working with Mies van der Rohe. This is one example of the projects that she worked on with him, but this is Villa Tugendhat in Brno. And her work, again, was joined on with Mies van der Rohe a lot. So there was a lot that they collaborated on that he got credit for. And to the point where it's actually very hard now. His estate, the Mies van der Rohe estate, is actually kind of redefining what was her work that got attributed to him. A lot of her furniture works were kind of incorrectly attributed. I wanted to bring this image to show that within this context of the Tugendhat, there's an erasure of the textiles within the architectural drawings. So in perspectives in photography, you can see the textiles here. They actually run all around the curtain window. There's a curtain here that should be located here. None of that exists within the architectural drawings, yet the furniture's in there, there's a piano in there. So there's this erasure in the hierarchy of what is considered important to the architecture. And even though she worked really closely with him on this project and many others, when we look at the architectural drawings, the architect himself has kind of erased the importance of the textile in the architectural representation and in the spatial construct. This curtain is absolutely integral to the architectural construction, right? And yet it does not exist in these drawings. So jumping forward in time, looking much more modern, we can easily draw a direct line from a figure like Lily Reich, who, in addition to Bill Tugendhat, worked on a lot of exhibitions, to a much more current figure, Petra Blaise, who founded the firm Inside Outside. And her firm often works with OMA, so you might recognize this is Casa da Música in Portugal, and this is the Seattle Public Library. She works on this like very, very grand scale and has kind of surpassed some of the ideas and hopes of earlier textile workers and within modernism. Annie Albers in the 50s and 60s was like appealing to the architectural community to integrate textiles more into their designs. And but this is so much further beyond what they were imagining at the time because of how much the dialogue around what textiles could be was like being suppressed within architecture. But she's working on this incredibly grand scale to the point where structure is involved, the operability is incredibly important, and is having to collaborate with structural engineers, the architect obviously, lighting and sound engineers, and even here the landscape architects. So really thinking about the systems of the textiles beyond just decoration. And then a little note on, I'm gonna see if I can pull this up. There's been an underlying theme in my research which is the way that textiles get represented, and her firm, their approach, this is another project, this is Maison en Bordeaux. Is that pulling up? So her approach is, she has sketches, but she spends a lot of time with representing their work through videography, which I think is an interesting and potentially really powerful tool for showing how dynamic and important the curtain or like any kind of textile can be in activating the architectural space. This is going to go on quite a bit longer. Might jump forward a little bit. So this is the kind of thing that you can't really capture in a drawing, or haven't seen captured yet in a drawing. Yeah, I kind of touched on this, but the integration of the interior and the exterior, I think the curtain itself being this sort of potential extension of what the facade is or the cladding is, but then also on the surface of a rug on the floor, extending the exterior landscape into the interior and vice versa. So just this approach to this thing, the textile, is not this kind of self-contained afterthought. This is incredibly connected to the architectural conceit. And then I kind of wanted to touch forward, like kind of again moving within this modern contemporary realm, and talk about a few other projects and approaches. I have sort of these themes that I keep kind of coming back to. So these themes of like loss, of temporality, of threshold and liminality, adaptability, representation or kind of lack thereof. So this is a project by Office, Kirsten Gears, David Van Severen in Bahrain, and the kind of main conceit of this project is this stage curtain that encompasses the whole building, so it becomes the facade. And the way that it ends up getting represented in this this rendering is it becomes this kind of solid element, and you lose this like sense of curtain, even when it's more open. Though there is kind of an attempt here, I don't think it really does justice to what you actually see in photography. Similarly, in plan, there's just a very simple dashed line that goes all the way around that does technically indicate where this curtain is, but we don't really understand that to be a part of the space. It's much harder to understand than the columns that we see here. So so as I'm looking forward into like the next phase of my research, I'm trying to find examples of and like kind of pick apart how we can approach representing textiles in an architectural drawing that can actually be much more clear and like kind of front or center the textile. As you can see, this is the impact of the curtain visually through photography is much stronger than it is through any of the drawing systems that they have on their website. Kind of taking a little bit of a left turn, I have a few other projects thinking about kind of temporality. A lot of times we associate curtains with being very quick solutions or additive solutions, and I think that is important to think about. So this is an example of like emergency architecture, right? So emergency housing that can be deployed across almost anywhere. This is a Shigeru Ban project, and it's been readapted around the world and also into exhibition spaces as well. to highlight refugees and that kind of thing. So this sense of the curtain or the textile being able to be quite permanent and integrated with a very quote unquote permanent architecture, while also being able to jump forward and act very quickly in a sort of crisis situation, and how the curtain can do both of these things, and is incredibly versatile. Similarly, within this very like kind of small space of time, we have textiles being these sort of additional facade layers. Again, kind of a very temporary approach. This is scaffolding that sort of fully encases a building and redefines a skyline. This is in Hong Kong. Or a type of scaffolding that hides the sort of the ugliness beyond with a new temporary design that says something about the context. So this is a project in Rome. I don't think it's up anymore, but it was sort of recreating or recombining some of the elements of the facade beyond that was being covered, while also kind of bringing in some of the elements from similar architecture around and by the same architect. So this sort of reinterpretation that could get printed onto a textile within a very relatively quick context. So it can re-engage people with the city while being relatively kind of innocuous, and we can kind of continue on our daily life without having like the construction sort of like making the city ugly, if you will. So the textile being kind of seen as this patch that can be very versatile in that way. And in today's context, the textile is changing a lot as well. So through materiality, there's so much going into the technology of this. This is a system called iMesh that is kind of integrated with it's a textile mineral system. So it's much more durable than a lot of older versions of textiles like cotton or wool or something like that. So much more durable in the exterior environment, and has the ability to be integrated in a lot in additional contexts, and stay up longer, and react more to sun exposure as needed or structure as needed. And then similarly, there are developments in textiles being structural elements themselves. So this is an experiment that was done at Maxi called Knit Nervi, and it's developing this structural membrane based on the thin shell concrete structures. And then on the right, this is a new textile membrane system that is structural in itself. So these panels are structural, and this is really flipping the ideologies that were developed in modernism about textiles being separate from structure and therefore less important, and then kind of pushed down in the dialogue of what is architecture, right? So if textiles can become structural again, I think they can be considered architectural elements on their own without them being structure, but with this sort of development technologically, we can also kind of invert that dialogue that textiles are themselves structural as well now. So they can do a lot of the same things that other materials, that we've associated with other materials. So it's a very interesting process. And then I've also been thinking a lot about installations. This is Dohosa, and then Robert Irwin. These are both artists. The installation world, I think, is a really helpful kind of mode to research for myself in thinking about. They kind of push the envelope of symbolism and particularly like with Robert Irwin, liminality being a very important element within his work. So exhibitions and installations are a really helpful way of kind of pushing the envelope of what we think textiles can do in a kind of spatial context. That's where a lot of experimentation exists, and I think that there's a lot to be translated into a more overtly architectural context. And then lastly is something that I've been kind of touching on the whole time, but the consideration of representation and documentation within textiles, and they're sort of like within kind of an architectural context. So this project in particular, which is Jean-Claude and I think maybe this one was just Jean-Claude, but their work is to this day very much connected to textiles. They're kind of famous for like the wrapping of buildings. So you might have seen the wrapping of the Arc de Triomphe, or the wrapping of the Berlin what was the building? Thank you. I don't speak German. So they're very famous for that work, but what's interesting about the way that they fund their work has been partly through creating drawings and representations of their concept in order to fund it, and then they can actually carry it out. So because textiles are so at the center of their work, you can see them being represented relatively well, and in a different way than a lot of architects have in the past represented or not included textiles within their architectural drawings. So in many ways, I'm looking kind of outside of direct architecture in order to think about how I might push textiles more into the architectural space for my own design work in the future. So to kind of conclude, I have a bunch of questions that I'm thinking about approaching. So for anyone who doesn't know the DRD program, the MPhil program, the next step is to do a design, a kind of research design from this initial research. And so the sort of questions that I'm posing are, how can textiles create space and potentiality or liminality to start to develop more of a layering or like manipulation of the spectrum of spatial experience. So how can that be expanded upon from other building materials, and how can like the notion of the building envelope continue to be challenged? How can the textile be this kind of moment of performance while also adapting to climate or the sun or something like that? So how does it adapt in a moment or create a moment, but then how does it respond to the needs of people within kind of like the cycles of a day or a week or a month or an event. How can textiles be like more sort of activated and responsive to an overall architectural system? So how can we like integrate them with other materials in order to kind of to strengthen the whole concept and not see them as this kind of additional thing that's being added in. And then even going back to some of the early research on archaeology, which I think is actually really helpful. It can be really easy, I think, to think about projects today, how they're using them, but this kind of idea of ephemerality and like loss of the textile over like hundreds of years has been kind of sticking in my brain quite a bit. And so I'm asking the question of like, how can we make sure like the presence of textiles and the way that they're being used is legible even long after they're gone? And how can we manipulate the architecture through like the joinery to kind of create this sort of tension between the ephemeral architectural elements of the textile versus the more quote-unquote permanent structures of the architectural system. So at this point, I am hoping to kind of work in a way that I'm developing a kind of an installation that is both like the subject and a sort of representation of the research. So it's both spatial and research-oriented design proposal is kind of the next step. I think that's everything for me.